Good day. Today is Saturday, 12th July 2025, and I'm going to begin this program by returning to the topic of the assassination of the Ukrainian SBU Colonel Ivan Veronic in Kiev a few days ago, because we've had a very interesting article about him in the New York Times, which strongly reinforces my own belief that he is probably the first important target of retaliatory action taken by the Russians against senior Ukrainian officials. Because Colonel Veronic, as it turns out, is an interesting man with a most interesting history. Firstly, it appears that he was the department chief of a department within the SBU, Ukraine's counterintelligence agency, which also, by the way, conducts intelligence work. And from what I can tell from the way in which this department is described in the New York Times, it appears to have been a department that was mostly engaged in the assassination of various individuals in Russia and in the two Donbass republics, the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics, which have taken place continuously since 2014. So, to give an example, he appears to have been, this department seems to have been responsible for the assassination of two well-known Donetsk militia leaders who go under the names of Motorola and Givi. He appears to have been behind, or at least there's suggestions that he was behind the assassination of the head of the Donetsk People's Republic, Zakharchenko, and apparently he's been involved in various other activities and played a significant role personally in Ukrainian operations inside Kursk region after the Ukrainians broke into Kursk region in August of last year. And perhaps it's worth repeating that the Russians have made various claims, various very detailed claims about war crimes which they say were carried out by the Ukrainian armed forces in Kursk region during the period when they were there, including the killing of civilians in various villages. So Veronic, it seems to me, is an obvious person for the Russian intelligence agencies to choose to target if they're given the green light to do so by the authorities in Moscow. And he's perhaps an obvious person to start if you are indeed beginning that kind of campaign. So, as I said, an interesting man and an interesting target. He was clearly killed by a professional assassin using a silenced pistol. Interestingly, not a bomb or anything of that kind. And as I discussed in my program yesterday, there are reports that at least one other senior Ukrainian army officer, a colonel in the agency that is responsible for recruitment, the conscription of Ukrainians across Ukraine, that he was targeted and assassinated as well at some point over the last couple of days or maybe weeks. And of course the Russians, as everybody who follows the war closely is aware, have been over the last couple of weeks specifically targeting the various recruitment centers that across Ukraine, the various offices and buildings used by Ukraine's recruitment agency, relying supposedly on information provided to them by Ukrainian civilians who regard this particular agency with abhorrence. So all of this taken together does make me very strongly inclined to believe that we are indeed at the beginning, and I stress I think this is very much the beginning, of a Russian campaign, counter-campaign, to target various individuals within the Ukrainian military and intelligence apparatus. Now, I suspect that for the moment, and also judging by these targets, the Russian leadership has placed certain restrictions on how this operation is conducted, so that it is intelligence and security officials within Ukraine who are now the primary targets. This is my guess, by the way. I have no external information to support this view. But anyway, that it is, as I said, intelligence and security officials who are being targeted. The executives, in other words, who carry out the various assassinations and recruit the people across Ukraine and do the other sabotage operations inside Russian territory, rather than the political leaders who are ultimately, according to the Russians at least, responsible for ordering the Ukrainian agencies to conduct these sort of attacks. But to reiterate again, Russian officials, including Putin himself, have made it fairly clear that they do believe that political leaders are in fact responsible for these assassinations, the Ukrainian assassinations of prominent people in Russia. And very recklessly, Zelensky himself, as I remember, a couple of weeks ago, after the last assassination of a general on Russian territory, actually held a meeting of the Ukrainian intelligence officials, and in which he basically gave the strong impression, at least the public reports gave the impression, I don't have any doubt that this is indeed what happened, that he actually commended them on their success in carrying out this assassination, this particular assassination. So it seems to me that it is almost certainly now only a question of time before the Russians enlarge what they are doing and start creeping up the command chain, targeting the people who have been involved in carrying out this kind of thing. Now, to repeat again, this is all very disturbing and very difficult. And of course, if the Russians come out and start assassinating Ukrainian political leaders, then of course the Ukrainians, you could say, would seek to do the same thing. Except that Kiril Budanov, Ukraine's own military intelligence chief, as I well remember, some months ago, actually confirmed that the Ukrainians have, in fact, already been attempting to do these very things. That the Ukrainians have, in fact, made several attempts already to assassinate Putin himself. In fact, I think we have clear evidence of one, and that was a Ukrainian drone attack that took place on the Kremlin itself, which appeared to be targeting the room in the Senate Palace inside the Kremlin where Putin has his office, just saying. Anyway, the Budanov said that the Ukrainians have already made attempts to assassinate Putin, but obviously these assassination attempts so far have been unsuccessful. Now, on that topic, there has been an interview given to the London Times by Resnikov, the former Ukrainian Defense Minister, which looked at in the context of what does seem to me to be this escalating dirty war, had rather disturbing implications. Now, Resnikov, who one must assume is fairly well informed about what the decision making in Kiev is, and who was, of course, the former defense minister and was presumably particularly well informed about what the Ukrainians had been up to whilst he was defense minister. Anyway, Resnikov said that there is no possibility that the Russians will agree to any kind of peace settlement on Ukrainian or Western terms, whilst the present political leadership in Russia remains in control. He said that in light of this, Ukraine must forget about negotiations or about trying to achieve a diplomatic solution to the crisis. Instead, it was focused on fighting for its own survival, waiting for the day when the leadership in Russia changes, at which point perhaps it might be possible for the Ukrainians and the Russians to learn to live with each other again. Now, the article, when I read it, it was obvious to me that it had been carefully watered down to make it more acceptable to British readers. But in light of what Budanov has said in the past about Ukrainian attempts to assassinate Putin, and what is happening now, and as I said, the assassination of Colonel Veronic seems to point to that direction. Anyway, what Resnikov said, it does seem to me, could possibly have a rather more sinister ring to it than first appears. Because when Resnikov says that in order for there to be a peace on Ukrainian terms, the political leadership in Russia must change, well, isn't that perhaps telling us that the Ukrainians are indeed redoubling their efforts to reach the Russian leadership itself? Just saying. In which case, to repeat again, I think that it's more likely than not that the Russians will reciprocate in some form. Now, Putin himself, just to finish on this topic, this rather uncomfortable topic, which, by the way, I am very uncomfortable talking about. Anyway, Putin himself did discuss a few months ago, the question of whether or not it made any sense for the Russians to come after Zelensky himself. And Putin said that this was not something that it was in Russia's interest to do, because the current Ukrainian leadership, Zelensky himself, are essentially irrational people. So why eliminate an irrational leadership in Ukraine and replace it with a more rational one which might lead Ukraine more effectively and more successfully than the present Ukrainian leadership is doing? Now, that was interesting, actually, looking back, and especially so in light of an article that has just appeared in the Swiss media, which has been discussing Ukraine's options in the war. And it says that the Russians are making little secret now that the Russian offensive is not just a case of aggressive attrition. They don't use the word, but I've used it before. Aggressive attrition, trying to grind down the Ukrainian military. Instead, what the Russians are doing along the various battlefronts is working towards achieving a knockout blow of the Ukrainian army, that they are seeking basically to collapse the entire front line, and they're establishing launch positions in northern Ukraine, in Sumy region, in Kharkiv region, and in those places which they could use in the event that there is a collapse of the front lines, in order to deal some kind of knockout strike with the reserve armies they have in position already. And this article in the Swiss media then went on to say that given this situation, Ukraine basically has two choices. It seems to accept that sooner or later the Russians will achieve some kind of a breakthrough. So it says that given the steady increase in Russian pressure, the Ukrainians have really two choices. Option one is to do what they're doing at the moment, try and hold back the Russians to the extent that they can, burning through their resources, but clinging on, hoping to parry the Russian offensive until the autumn, until some kind of negotiation gets underway, and until some kind of a ceasefire is achieved. That is option one. That is the option that this article acknowledges Ukraine is following now. Option two is to undertake a strategic retreat to new front lines, to new prepared front lines. The various translations I've seen of this article make it unclear to me whether these new front lines would be located east of the Dnieper River or west on the west bank of the Dnieper. For the record, from what I can see, it looks as if the new front lines, the new fortified lines, are envisaged to be still east of the Dnieper River, and gradually to effect a retreat to these front lines to prevent the encirclement of the Ukrainian forces and a potential collapse. Now, the article says that logically, at some point, if there is no peace agreement, and we'll come to that later, the best course for the Ukrainians to follow would be option two. Option one might have some validity for the moment, but option two is perhaps the more feasible one in the long term. But the decision ultimately is not going to be taken by the Ukrainian military, by General Syrskyi. It is going to be taken by Zelensky. And Zelensky has shown a continuous and extreme aversion to countenancing retreats on any part of the front line. And I think, by the way, that that is true. And it takes us back to what Putin said about the attraction of keeping Zelensky in place, because his decisions ultimately always play out against Ukraine's long-term interests. Now, that brings me to one of the most interesting messages I've had throughout the entire course of the special military operation. Now, I have received information about the state of the war from an individual who is fighting on the Ukrainian side in one of the nationalist battalions. I'm not going to say which one, though the name is well known, but there are several, so don't make any assumptions about that. I'm not going to say which one, and I'm not going to provide any information about this person, save to say that I have no doubt at all that this information is completely reliable. And it would seem that this person also, though he provided this information through a third party, was well aware of the Duran and presumably of the stance that it is taking. Now, this person provided a great deal of information about the situation of the Ukrainian military at the moment, and also about the steps that it is taking in the current crisis that it is facing, operational crisis that it is facing. And I've had a significant amount of very interesting information, which again I'm not going to disclose because I don't wish to put this person in any danger in any way. But there's a number of things that I think I can disclose. Firstly, there is an admission, an awareness that the military situation is bad and that it is getting worse. And bear in mind, this person comes from one of the nationalist battalions, just to repeat that again. Secondly, most of the original people who were serving in this individual's battalion, most of the people who were there, the great majority of them, at the start of the special military operation, have gone. Either they have been killed in battle or they have been wounded. The people who now staff this battalion are people who have been recruited to it over the last 3 years, since the start of the special military operation, in fact. In other words, the battalion, its personnel, are different from the ones that they were. Thirdly, there is certainly on the part of this person disillusion with the quality of the Western military equipment and training. And there's been specific comments about some of the equipment, but I think in general and overall, it has turned out to be significantly less effective than previously supposed. But then this person gave me some further information, which I found especially interesting. First of all, he confirmed that the Ukrainian military units are repeatedly placed in positions where they are asked to defend undefendable places and are expected to hold on to these positions for far too long. He says that there is a conflict continuously between the military and the political leadership about this, and he spoke about the very difficult situation in which some Ukrainian senior commanders find themselves in. They are obliged to order their men to hold undefendable positions. They find themselves at serious risk if they order retreats. Mostly what these people do is that they place their headquarters some distance from the front lines, because that is the only place that can be safe for them. But of course, this inevitably creates tensions between the officers and the soldiers. And this person also informed me that there is a considerable and large-scale intelligence gathering apparatus or apparatus of informers right across the Ukrainian military, run by Budanov's office. And bear in mind, Budanov is the head of Ukrainian military intelligence, whose job it is to make sure that Ukrainian military units stay in line and do what they're told, even if it makes no significant military sense. So this is what this person is saying. He also says that as a result of this honeycomb of informers that Budanov's office has established, within the Ukrainian military. Budanov himself is a deeply unpopular figure within the military, amongst the soldiers and amongst the junior officers as well. The idea that Budanov is someone, for example, who would be looked to with favour if he were to become defense minister, as was briefly floated last year, or who would be welcomed as the new military commander, which was also floated at the time when Zaluzhny was dismissed from that post by Zelensky. Well, that does not accord with what this person is saying. This person, as I said, from one of the nationalist battalions is saying. But perhaps the most interesting piece of information of all is that this person is saying that already within the battalion that this person serves in, there is already preparation, psychological and other preparation, for the battle which apparently they all take for granted is coming, which is the battle for Kiev itself. That it's widely, maybe even universally assumed that the war is going to go on and that eventually it's all going to culminate in some kind of battle in which the Russian army invests Kiev and ultimately seeks to storm it. Not perhaps quite a Battle of Berlin scenario. The Russians have sought to avoid getting involved and getting bogged down in particular battles. But anyway, this is something like that, maybe, with the Russians perhaps taking decisions to surround Kiev and cut off the supply lines and do that kind of thing. But the assumption the assumption this person has and his comrades have is that that is indeed where the conflict is ultimately heading towards. Now, to stress again, this individual who's speaking in this way is speaking for himself. So one can't assume that this is the universal view of everybody within the Ukrainian military, but he does seem to be well informed. And I would say that he's also provided a certain perspective of what happened in specific battles, which I'm not going to discuss because I worry that if I do, that also will give clues to this person's identity. Anyway, I found it interesting, not just that, not just the information that this person was providing, but I also found interesting that coming from that particular source, it was being provided at all. Just saying. Anyway, there we go. That's one piece of information. Now, and a further piece of information which somewhat dovetails with that article that has appeared in the Swiss media has now come from Kiril Budanov himself. Now, Budanov, as I have discussed in recent programs, has recently taken to saying that, a couple of months ago started saying that Ukraine could hold its positions successfully until midsummer. After midsummer, the situation would start to deteriorate, and which is in effect what we're starting to see, and that the only way to prevent that happening was through some kind of peace agreement. And he's also come out more recently and said that nobody in Ukraine who has any sense of reality anymore seriously believes that the Ukrainians will ever be able to recapture the territory, the former Ukrainian territory, which the Russians control. I pointed out that these are realistic statements and that they go completely against the spirit and the words that the rest of the Ukrainian leadership continues using. But Budanov has also just very recently made certain further comments. He said that the Russians are indeed pushing hard across the front lines. He says that he believes that there is a good prospect of a ceasefire being negotiated sometime this year. He says that there will be three parties to the discussions for the ceasefire. These will be the United States, Russia, and Ukraine. He obviously doesn't seem to think that the Europeans are going to play much part in that. And lastly, he says that he does not personally believe that the Russians will succeed in capturing the whole of Donbass this year. Now, that, it seems to me, is consistent with what that Swiss article spoke about. Option one, hold on as long as possible along the existing front lines, try to hold back the Russian offensive, hold out until a ceasefire is achieved in the autumn. And that seems to be precisely the line that Budanov himself is taking at this particular moment in time. So much so, in fact, that I wonder whether Budanov is the source of that article in the Swiss media. Whether what he's basically saying is that, yes, we can hold these positions for the moment, but we won't be able to hold them indefinitely. We have up to the autumn to keep doing this. But if there is no ceasefire by then we run the risk of collapse and potential encirclement of large parts of our military, and that what we need to do at that point is think about building up fortified lines to retreat to behind the existing front lines. Now, again, this is also interesting because there are some reports that the Ukrainians are indeed in the process of taking the first steps to build up fortified positions west of the existing front lines, as I understand it, west of the great line of towns that the Ukrainians are currently defending: Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, Konstantinovka, and Pokrovsk. And could that also perhaps partly account for the recent Russian attacks on the cement factories in western Ukraine, that the Russians are aware that the Ukrainians are trying to build a fortified line west of these towns, and that the Russians are conducting attacks against these factories precisely in order to make it more difficult to complete work on this new front line that is being spoken about. Now, as I said, some conjecture here, but based on things that the Ukrainians are saying and consistent with the information that we're getting from the battlefields themselves. They show that there is indeed a deterioration. Even the Ukrainians increasingly acknowledge this. and that there is a continued Russian advance. And we see that one Ukrainian soldier from one of the nationalist battalions apparently believes and says that others of his comrades believe also that there is not in fact going to be a negotiated agreement, that there is not going to be the truce that Budanov is still gambling on by the autumn, that there presumably will be some kind of a retreat eventually to this fallback line, but that it is unlikely it will hold for very long, and that there will then be, at some point, perhaps next year, a battle for Kiev itself, which will presumably be the battle that will decide the war. Anyway, I set all of this out. It is all interesting, and it's one of those situations where different pieces of information which are coming at random all appear to be supporting each other, and in a way that argues strongly against any kind of coordinated campaign, by the way, to deceive. We have the Russians now starting to, well, so it seems to me, assassinate senior Ukrainian intelligence and security officers. By the way, I should say that this Ukrainian soldier, who, as I said, has been providing me with this information, appears to believe that Veronic was indeed killed as part of an internecine battle within the Ukrainian intelligence services. But he seems to have this very dim view of these services altogether, and I don't believe that he has any specific information about this. It still seems to me more likely that it is the Russians who are behind this killing, just to say. Anyway, we've had the assassinations, we've had the attacks on the recruitment centres, the attacks on the factories, the cement factories, to disrupt the creation of new fortified lines east of the Dnieper. We've had the pattern of Russian military advances and attacks, which I will discuss later in this program, shortly in fact. And we've had this information from this soldier, the article that's appeared in the Swiss media, and Budanov's own comments. And it seems to me that they do dovetail, and they do perhaps, if you look at them and put them all together, they do provide a consistent story. That doesn't mean, as I said, that they're all coordinating. It doesn't mean that everything, as I said, slots in exactly. But as I said, it does look to me as if we're not getting a consistent story. Now that does bring me now to the military situation. And last night, again, the Russians were hammering Kiev with drones and missiles. The war in the sky continues, and it continues to be tilted massively to Russia's underlying advantage. And apparently this attack, which involved missiles and drones being launched right across Ukraine, targeted a multiplicity of cities. Kiev itself was badly hammered again last night. So was Kharkiv, so was Lutsk, where there is apparently a large airfield. I believe there were also other targets as well. But again, I'm not able to say which they were. And it seems that the Russians also launched missiles, Iskander missiles, and that they also launched other types of missiles as well against the various targets that they attacked. And there were, again, hundreds of drones in the sky. And it's important to say that these drones, the various types of Geran drones that now exist, we are still not at peak production of these drones. That will probably only be achieved, well, it will only be achieved in the autumn, or perhaps even towards the end of this year. The Russians may be producing around 500 of these drones a day. They apparently have a significant stockpile of these drones, but the general consensus is that we're looking at a situation later this year where the Russians will be producing around 1,000 drones a day, and we've not yet reached that point, and we've not yet reached that anything close to that level. And it's clear that these attacks are starting to have an effect on Ukrainian civilian morale. There's a long article about this in The Guardian. It's blitz, blitz, blitz. Kiev's shelters fill up as Russia intensifies aerial attacks. People in the Ukrainian capital are exhausted and struggling for normality amid a dramatic rise in bombardment. And as I said, this is going on every day. It says that across Ukraine's capital, people take cover in metro stations, subways, and the lower floors of blocks of flats. They're heeding official advice to stay between two walls with bathrooms, a favourite hiding spot. And, I'm not going to read the entirety of the article. Some of its contents, I should say, I found distressing. So far, despite the intensity of the missile and drone strikes, the number of civilian casualties is extraordinary, remains extremely low. We're not looking at anything remotely like what is happening in Gaza, for example. I mean, it's nothing like on that kind of scale. In terms of civilian casualties, the Russians continue to attack facilities, industrial and military facilities in and around Kiev, including, I suspect, the positions where the Patriot missile batteries are located. But undoubtedly, the presence of all of these drones is gradually wearing people down, and inevitably and correctly, they have to take their precautions. And it talks about the article. I'm going to just give one example. The article talks about an ugly whine in the sky immediately above the district of Padil. It came from a kamikaze drone. It's always referred to in The Guardian as a Shahed. The Russians, of course, call these drones Gerans, and it's worth saying that though the original blueprint for these drones came from Iran, the Russian Gerans have now evolved way beyond the Iranian Shaheds. And we told about how the streets echoed with booms and rat-tat-tat machine gun fire as Ukrainian air defense units tried to bring them down. Now, again, the Ukrainians make extraordinary claims about their success in shooting down drones and missiles. Various people, including on threads to these programs, have pointed out if the Ukrainians are indeed being as successful as they claim, why are they complaining that they're so short of air defences? It's an obvious point, and it's a correct one. But anyway, the grim reality is that, as far as I can see, the drones and the missiles do get through, and they are causing massive damage, and the damage is intensifying, and it is hitting home across Ukraine increasingly. Now, there's been an interesting article in the Daily Telegraph which speaks about how Russia is accelerating missile production with China's help. It's always everything that the Russians do in terms of increasing production is always said to be done with Chinese help. The article then goes on to say Russia is speeding up missile production for its war in Ukraine and a possible future conflict with NATO with the help of China. Moscow is reportedly using Chinese companies and Russian intermediaries to dodge Western sanctions on manufacturing equipment for missiles. It is building up stockpiles that would last for 2 years if the current pace of strikes against Ukraine was maintained, according to an investigation by the Kiev Independent newspaper. And then we're told that Budanov's organization has told the Kiev Independent that Russia is not just ramping up production to replace missiles used in the war. According to our data, Russia is building up a stockpile of missiles of various types. They're preparing for a long war. And the Daily Telegraph then goes on to tell us that the Institute for the Study of War is now warning that Russia is preparing for a protracted war in Ukraine and a potential expanded future conflict with NATO. Russia produced nearly 3 times more Iskander-M ballistic missiles, 700 compared to 250 in 2023. And Russia is not using all the missiles it is producing, which suggests a stockpile is being built up. Russia has reserves of about 600 Iskander-M ballistic missiles and another 300 Iskander-K missiles, enough for 2 years of fighting. This is the stockpile. This is separate from current production. The Russians are launching more missiles, are launching fewer missiles at Ukraine every night than they are actually producing. And then we're told that Russia's Votkynsk plant, which produces ballistic and cruise missiles, such as the Iskander, and it also produces ICBMs. That the Votkynsk plant is supposedly under sanctions, and that they should have stopped its production. At least that was what the West expected. Instead, it is hiring an extra 2,500 extra workers. It's built new facilities and has significantly increased production since 2022. And then there's references to satellite imagery, which and further analysis of the plant's business operations, which has been carried out by the Kiev Independent. And anyway, the totality suggests that the quantity of missiles that the Russians are producing is growing constantly and all the time. Now, here I would make a few very quick observations. We've had a great deal said about North Korean and Iranian ballistic missiles being used by the Russians. Maybe they are. But is this really consistent with the information we've just been provided, that the Russians are launching fewer Iskander and other missiles against Ukraine than they are producing? It's starting to look as if the Russians are mostly still relying on their own domestic production of missiles to conduct the war. And they are building up a stockpile of these missiles. They're able to do that. They're able, in other words, if they choose, to overwhelm Ukraine's defenses, and they can keep on pounding Ukraine, not just with drones, and as I've said, drone production continues to grow, but also with missiles at the same rate that they are now currently doing, night after night, indefinitely, They could do it for 2 years on the strength of their existing stockpile. They can, of course, do it indefinitely because they're adding to their stockpile, it seems, every day. And that doesn't take into account whatever missiles, additional missiles, they might be importing from their friends in North Korea. And possibly, though less plausibly, Iran. So, the war in the sky is clearly going ever more decisively in Russia's favour. And the Daily Telegraph, not coincidentally, one suspects, has a further article, which is about the fact that Ukraine, and the title is, Ukraine is going to receive just a third of the Patriot missiles promised by Trump. I've already discussed this previously. The US president said he would free up 10 of the 30 air defense interceptors currently being held in Poland. So despite all of the talk last week about how Trump is resuming weapons deliveries to Ukraine, Zelensky has just come out and said that the United States is resuming weapons deliveries to Ukraine. Ukraine is only getting a batch of 10 out of the 30 air defense missile interceptors. And there's been talk about sending more, but as the Daily Telegraph and the Financial Times have both now noticed, Trump has again made further comments about this, and he seems to be saying that the Patriot missiles and other weapons that the United States would henceforth be supplying to Ukraine would be paid for. In other words, would be bought. It would not be simply provided to Ukraine any longer, and they would be paid for by the Europeans. Now, this is something that Friedrich Merz has already talked about, and that, it does seem to me, somewhat pushes back or contradicts the reports we saw a couple of days ago about Trump now perhaps intending to exercise his drawdown authority to authorize a $300 million aid package for Ukraine over and above the already existing aid packages previously authorized by Biden, and that the purpose of this $300 million drawdown might perhaps be to provide a further missile battery, Patriot missile battery, to Ukraine. There is a number of people have pointed out to me that is unlikely, actually, because the cost of a complete missile battery, a Patriot missile battery, runs into the billions, and the figure that is being cited is just $300 million. Apparently, everything else is supposed to come from weapons, from money will be paid for by the Europeans. And by the way, that's also consistent with what the US ambassador to NATO has just said. From this point on, it will be the Europeans who will have to pay. They will have to pay for any American weapons that the United States continues to supply to Ukraine, drawn from its own stockpiles. Now, that doesn't address, however, the fundamental problem of the fact that the stockpiles are dwindling. And here we come back to the earlier article in the Daily Telegraph about the fact that Russian missile stockpiles are growing even as the Russians launch missiles every night now at Ukraine. How is the United States, whose own production of missiles is only increasing very gradually. How is it going to keep up with that? Apparently, the intention is that the Europeans will buy weapons from Ukraine out of existing US stockpiles. But those stockpiles are going to run down very, very quickly. There's been a suggestion from General Zaluzhny, the former Ukrainian military chief, who is now, of course, Ukraine's ambassador to London, that the Ukrainians could buy obsolete missiles from the United States. Supposedly, there's large numbers of Hellfire anti-tank missiles. These are helicopter launched missiles held by the United States, and the United States could supply some of those. But as I understand it, the Hellfire is an air-launched system. So how can Ukraine operate it, given that the Russians dominate the skies? Just saying. So again, none of these plans address these underlying problems of depleting depleting American inventories and essentially non-existent European inventories, as opposed to expanding Russian inventories and ever expanding Russian missile and drone production. Ultimately, as various people, Alex Vashinin, Brian Beletic, lots of people have pointed out, despite that desperate article in The Economist that appeared about a week ago, which I discussed about how supposedly one doesn't need an industrial base to rearm. The reality is that war, as this conflict in Ukraine has demonstrated, is industrial, and the West is losing the industrial race. The gap between the Russians, what the Russians have, and what the West has, is increasing. So there it is. It's fairly clear to me that in this kind of situation, whatever weapons Trump puts together, whatever dribbles of weapons he puts together, it's not going to make any effective difference. There's even an article, by the way, in the Financial Times looking at this very same situation, which essentially says this. The article is about how Trump is supposedly annoyed with Putin and is tilting back to Ukraine, but the article cautions that this could change and that Trump still isn't really very much enamored of Ukraine. But buried in it, there is this admission. Patriot missiles were critical to Ukraine's ability to better defend its troops and its cities. They overall cannot, however, change its ability to strike back against Russia, nor shift the overall dynamic of the war. And one of the officials the Financial Times has spoken to says there's a little bit of overexcitement based on a shift in tone. This is about the Patriots, but we're not seeing that translate into major actions. In other words, Trump can supply a few dribbles of Patriots, but ultimately he cannot reverse the tide of the war. That is impossible, including and specifically the war in the sky. Anyway, that's what I wanted to say. Now, of course, the war in the sky isn't just missiles and drones, it's also jets and bombs. And here again, the Russians have an ever-growing margin of superiority, so one senses. There are reports, increasing reports, of Russian bombing of Ukrainian positions further behind the Ukrainian front lines. There's particularly heavy bombing going on at the moment of the Ukrainian positions in Sumy region, where the Ukrainians attempted, unsuccessfully from what I can see, to launch various counterattacks in order to recapture a village called Kondratyevka, I hope that's correct, and also in Zaporozhye region. But as a number of articles are now pointing out, if the trend with the collapse of Ukrainian air defense continues, then Russian aircraft can start ranging deeper inside Ukraine, and with severe consequences for the Ukrainians, given the enormous Russian abundance now of the precision-guided FAB bombs, which the Russians are also producing in quantity. Now, before I continue, this is perhaps a good point to acknowledge an error that I made a few days ago. I said that, to my knowledge, production of Patriot missile interceptors is around 550 of these interceptors by the United States every year. It seems the total production is actually around 800. Contrary to what I believed and said, the 500 or 550 actually specifically relates to the modern PAC-3 interceptors. The United States also still produces around 250 to 300 PAC-2 interceptors, mostly designed to shoot down aircraft. I presume that those are being provided to American allies. The PAC-3 interceptors are intended for the United States itself. To repeat again, with the Patriot having to launch at least 2 interceptors in order to shoot down an incoming ballistic missile, 500 interceptors is going to, in theory, only going to be enough to counter 250 incoming missiles. Except that isn't the reality at all. I've had some information that, at least in Ukraine, Patriots tend to launch around 4 interceptors to try to shoot down an Iskander. And apparently they've basically stopped trying to intercept the hypersonic Kinzhals, simply because any attempt to counter them expends too many of these missiles altogether. So, well, you can do the maths. On that topic, satellite imagery has now been released of the Al Ubaid American base in Qatar. Now, it's been most interesting how over the last 2 weeks, satellite imagery has corrected many of the assumptions about, or rather many of the original claims about the Iranian missile offensive. I discussed in a recent program how, contrary to Israeli denials, it seems as if a significant number of Iranian missiles did penetrate Israeli air defenses and were able to inflict damage on at least 5 Israeli military sites. There's been apparently satellite imagery that confirms this. This had not been disclosed by the Israelis before, and in fact Israeli censorship had attempted to suppress information about this. Anyway, satellite imagery has now revealed that missiles did get through and did do real damage to these 5 Israeli military locations. But perhaps more interesting still is that we now have satellite imagery which shows, again, a certain amount of damage. I'm not going to try to quantify the damage to America's Al-Ubaid base in Qatar, also obviously done by an Iranian missile, one of the missiles that the Iranians launched in response to the American attack on their nuclear enrichment facilities. Now, this, of course, this information refutes a claim that President Trump himself made, which was that all of the Iranian missiles were shot down before they struck the American base facilities. It turns out that this is simply not the case. The Al-Ubaid facility was indeed hit. And there are now also reports of the number of air defense missiles that the United States had to expend to try to cover the attacks that were launched not just against Israel, but its own facilities. There's already been claims that between 15 and 20% of the entire THAAD stockpile was expended trying to shoot down Iranian ballistic missiles over the course of the 12-day war. I've read a claim that the Patriot missile batteries that were defending the Al-Ubaid base, and as we saw, with only partial success, because at least one Iranian missile, perhaps more, did get through. But those batteries apparently, over the course of the short time period when Iranian missiles were being launched against this base, this American base, the Americans expended something like 50 missiles, 50 Patriot missile interceptors in an attempt to defend this base. So that gives one a sense of the enormous imbalance that now exists. The Russians not only are producing more offensive missiles than the Americans are producing air defensive missiles. 700 Iskander-Ms a month, along with all sorts of other missiles as well, against just 550 PAC-3s, Patriot PAC-3s. But the United States and Israel and Ukraine would in practice have to launch many more missiles than the United States is producing to have any hope of shooting down any one of these incoming Russian missiles. And apparently the chances of it doing so, of them succeeding in shooting down these missiles, these incoming missiles, are diminishing as more advanced missiles, Iskander-Ms and Kinzhals, enter Russian service in increasing numbers. So that is the reality, and there is nothing that Donald Trump can do to change it, nothing that West European governments can do to change it either. Now, there's a lot of assumptions now about the sanctions announcement that some people are saying. There's a long article in the London Times which has attracted a great deal of attention. It says that Trump is considering a global oil embargo to squeeze Putin's war economy. This is based on the presumption that Trump would go ahead and enforce the 500% tariffs on countries that bought Russian oil. I should say that there's been barely a shift in the oil prices since all of these rumors appeared about these sanctions in the United States. that are being mulled in the United States, which makes me think, by the way, that the oil market does not really believe that Trump is going to impose any one of these sanctions that Lindsey Graham and Richard Blumenthal expect. The London Times article, when you read it, is entirely speculative about Trump's intentions, but seems to come round to the view that because of the immense effects on the global economy, including the American economy, Donald Trump is not going to actually agree to impose sanctions on anything like this kind of level, that the global blockade on Russian oil is an incredibly bad idea, which Trump himself is not really looking to implement. Trump himself is apparently still saying that he doesn't just want the right to decide when the sanctions are imposed, not to be subject to congressional oversight. He doesn't want any congressional oversight. He just wants to be the person who makes the decision whether or not to impose the sanctions, whether or not to grant waivers or otherwise. In which case, of course, as I've said, it's most likely that we're not going to see any significant increase in sanctions or tariff pressure from the United States on buyers of Russian oil at all. Just saying. The Russian ambassador to Denmark has now issued a strong warning against any attempt by NATO to impose a sea blockade on Russian shipping in the Baltic. He says that any idea of this kind is a fantasy, and a disastrous fantasy at that, and he's probably right. Budanov talks about a ceasefire. I have now read what Lavrov actually said following the meeting with Rubio. The Russian Foreign Ministry has provided an English language transcript of Lavrov's words. He was asked this question yesterday after a meeting with U.S. State Secretary Marco Rubio said a new plan for Ukraine had been discussed. Which side proposed new approaches? What are they about? And what makes them fundamentally different from the previous ones? Are US weapons supplies also part of the plan? Were they discussed? And Lavrov's actual reply to this question was as follows. I will use President Trump's words to answer your question. I'm not going to tell you. We're going to have a very big announcement to make. I am not sure about a big announcement, though, but you, as someone familiar with the diplomatic work and who often accompany us in our travels, know that there are things that are not commented on. Yes, we discussed Ukraine and reaffirmed the position articulated by President Putin in a conversation with President Trump on July 3rd and earlier occasions. Now, that doesn't seem to me to say that the Russians proposed any new ideas to Rubio. My impression is that what Lavrov is saying is that the Russians simply reaffirmed their existing positions. There is an article in the New York Times which says the same, essentially the same, that Putin is in no mood to compromise, that he believes that he's winning the war, that he believes that he can ride out any sanctions that are imposed, and that once the war is won, the United States and the Western powers are going to have to water down the sanctions anyway. So I don't get the sense that the Russians are shifting their positions at all. all that makes me think that if there were any new ideas, they came from Rubio rather than Lavrov. But as I discussed in my program yesterday, I'm far from convinced that anything really new over the course of that meeting was discussed at all. Anyway, the Russians have also published a readout of Lavrov's meeting with the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi in Kuala Lumpur. This is at the ASEAN summit where Lavrov met Rubio. And the Chinese have also published a readout of Wang Yi's meeting, the same meeting that Wang Yi had with Lavrov. And the Chinese and Russian readouts of this conversation between Lavrov and Wang Yi are actually remarkable, not because of their content, which is the usual. It talks about the Russian-Chinese relationship in the usual rhapsodic terms, but because of the omission. There is no reference to Ukraine at all. It's as if the whole topic wasn't discussed, which is very interesting. I can't imagine that this was the case. I'm sure that Wang Yi and Lavrov did discuss Ukraine. But if you judge by the readouts, it was in fact very much a secondary or minimal topic. Now, of course, it could be that Lavrov and Wang Yi did discuss Ukraine and that it was the major topic of discussion and that this was a contentious and difficult topic, and by agreement the two sides decided that they would not mention the fact in the readout. They would avoid all reference to Ukraine in the readout for that reason, because they couldn't agree on a form of words acceptable to both. And that is a possibility, but I have to say it is not consistent with what Chinese and Russian commentaries about this meeting and about the relationship between China and Russia in general are saying. So, again, it could be a more plausible explanation is that there is really little new to discuss about the conflict in Ukraine. No doubt Wang Yi and Lavrov touched on it, but that this wasn't the real topic of their discussion. Anyway, in the meantime, of course, the Europeans continue to press on with Ukraine and their support for Ukraine. And it is really becoming very, very bizarre. European attitudes to this are becoming very bizarre. Meloni in Italy has convened another big conference for Ukraine's post-war economic reconstruction. There was an article in The Guardian lamenting the fact that money is not being offered to move forward with this project. BlackRock, of course, has recently pulled out of this whole idea. Investors were not willing to come forward, so BlackRock has closed the fund that it had originally created for this Ukrainian reconstruction project. The Daily Telegraph has now published a similar commentary lamenting the fact that this project is going nowhere. This plan to put together a program for Ukraine's post-war reconstruction, it too laments that it is going nowhere. It puts the blame for that, by the way, on Donald Trump. I notice that all of these articles and commentaries, the articles that appeared about BlackRock basically pulling out of this program to rebuild Ukraine, the article in The Guardian about the effective failure of this conference, the article in the Daily Telegraph about the effective failure of this conference, none of them refer to the mineral rights extraction deal that the Ukrainians and the Americans finally agreed with between each other a few weeks ago. Wasn't that supposed to be the great vehicle that would provide for Ukraine's reconstruction? You won't find any reference or mention of it at all in any of these articles. It looks as if that whole plan to use Ukraine's mineral rights in order to provide security for some great funding of Ukraine, that whole plan has now been placed in the bottom drawer. Just saying. Anyway, the Europeans nonetheless continue to talk about further funding for Ukraine. They still talk about buying weapons, as we see, for Ukraine. They're doing all of these things, even as their economies fall ever deeper into crisis. The British economy contracted last month. That's 2 months of contraction now. The German economy continues to sag. There are reports that Britain's finances are now on an unsustainable pathway, and that there is now growing talk about a crisis in the financial markets looming over the horizon. I'm less familiar with the discussions taking place in Germany, but I suspect that that is true there also. One would assume that some kind of a reckoning is coming. I discussed in a recent program how I suspect that the recent decision by the European Court of Human Rights to find Russia guilty of every conceivable crime in Ukraine is intended to pave the way, perhaps, for a compensation decision which is going to be converted into some kind of court judgment, which will then be used to try to seize the frozen Russian assets. Maybe that is the eventual plan. But again, Donald Trump and others are worried about the development of the new payment systems. And no less a person than Vladimir Putin has said that the seizure of the Russian assets, the freezing of the Russian assets, facilitated the BRICS plans to push forward with the development of the new payment systems. It seems astonishing that in the conditions of economic recession and financial stress in Europe, the European leadership continues to be so committed to the apparently indefinite cost of sustaining Project Ukraine. Now, $300 billion or euros or whatever it is in frozen assets, that sounds like a huge amount, and it would roughly cover the amount that the Europeans have already spent on Ukraine over the last few years. But at this rate, it too will run out eventually. And what then? One would have thought that this would be something that people in Europe would be worrying about, and that doesn't even take into account the colossal reputational damage that the seizure of these reserves would give rise to. But no, there is no rethinking of this. There's no change. Maybe the Americans did propose something to the Russians in Kuala Lumpur. We'll see what comes of it. My own view is that if there is ever going to be a diplomatic solution, it will have to be through direct negotiations between the Americans and the Russians, excluding the Ukrainians entirely. There was a time in March when I thought that would happen, but it didn't. Anatol Lieven, I remember, suggested something like that some months ago. But for the moment, at least, there seems to be no movement forward in that direction. As I discussed in a program I did, I believe, 2 days ago, we are in effect stuck. Now, I will touch very briefly now on the military situation. There are reports which are coming from the Ukrainians themselves that the Ukrainians have withdrawn from Yunakovka in Sumy region. Our old friend Andrei Marochko says that this is correct, but that the Russians are in no rush to occupy the areas of Yunakovka that the Ukrainians have abandoned, because the Ukrainians still control some high ground to the south and west of Yunakovka, which would make the Russian troops who entered Yunakovka obvious targets. So firstly, the Ukrainians need to be pushed back from these heights. Well, we'll see. Marochko has also said, I think it was Marochko, that the Ukrainians still cling on to some buildings in one of the micro-districts in Chasiv Yar, but that all of the best Ukrainian troops have left Chasiv Yar. The battle for Chasiv Yar has in effect been abandoned by the Ukrainians. The best Ukrainian troops have all been redeployed to Sumy region. There's been more Russian advances in Kharkiv region. There are reports that the Russians are now in the process of encircling a village called Kolodizy, just north of Liman. This is in the Slavyansk area. There have been significant Russian advances south of Konstantinovka. And the pocket that the Ukrainians find themselves there in is shrinking. And things, it seems to me, are becoming more dangerous for the Ukrainians in those places. And the Russians continue their advances north of Pokrovsk. There was a report in Radovka that they've captured a village called Fyodorovka. Now that might be confusing it with a different village, but if this is correct, there is such a village north of Pokrovsk. And if the Russians have indeed captured it, then Ukrainian positions north of Pokrovsk have in effect collapsed. And that would definitely mean that Pokrovsk is in operational encirclement. And the Russians continue to advance westwards towards the Dnieper in western Donbass. The Russian Defense Minister Andrei Belousov was in this area, presumably looking at the logistic situations of the Russian troops there, and maybe also there to give some kind of fillip to the Russian troops who are fighting in this area. And the Russians also are pushing north towards Zaporozhye city from the village of Kamenska, which they recently captured. This is a very brief summary of what is an increasingly grave situation for the Ukrainians, but I'm going to stop there. Anyway, this is where I'm going to finish today's program. There'll be more from me soon. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, and by going to our shop. Links under this video. Last but not least, please remember, if you've liked this video, to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.